I want to go over the decade of tyranny, an article by Alex Jones, Steve Watson, and Paul Watson. There's been a loss of basic freedoms, has spurred a mass awakening. Next decade will be defined by the restoration of our liberties. Yeah, more than that, I think it's going to be defined by the Great Awakening, and in the next decade will be the decision on the true future of humanity. But during the first 9 years of the new millennium, we have been witness to a rapid erosion of freedom. Our basic liberties have been systematically deteriorating and diluted by a vast expansion of coordinated global tyranny. The decade is not over yet. There is still another year to go. However, given the mainstream media is obsessively compiling its own decades list, we felt it necessary to draw up our own and highlight the major events that have shaped the world we now live in and the future we face. Yeah, it's just been a decade of lies where they say the decade's over when there's a whole other year coming up. Just like they started the century a year early, the millennium a year early, the decade a year early. It's a joke. It is important to stress the fact that while we have indeed experienced a decade of tyranny, we have also seen a mass awakening, an expansion of knowledge, an exponential increase in opposition to the agenda we have come to know as the New World Order. Here is a chronological order following PrisonPlanet.com's defining moments of the decade. And, of course, there have been countless others. Sunday and into next week, we'll talk about what you think the biggest stories, both overreported, underreported, were, and what you think will happen in the next decade. That's coming up next week. 2001, 9/11. 9/11 was a precursor for everything that followed during the decade of tyranny. The immediate invasion of Afghanistan saw the U.S. go to war without formal declaration. The passage of the USA Patriot Act overnight, with members of Congress not even being afforded time to read it, paved the way for a decade of freedom-stripping government legislation that had nothing to do with even fighting the imaginary terror. The expansion of the phony war on terror is justification for big government, a domestic police state, and a interventionist foreign policy also stemmed directly from 9/11. We've now discovered under Homeland Security, the MIAC reports, and others that say this real system was set up for the American people. They know they're criminal. They know they're a bunch of crooks taking over. Over the past decade, we have ceaselessly exposed the lies behind 9/11. We have seen the 9/11 truth movement blossom from efforts by a select few individuals, myself who kicked it all off, to encompass the work of thousands, if not millions. While there is no doubt 9/11 is the decade of tyranny's defining moment, exposing the truth behind it has also led to an equally influential awakening that is still ongoing. I would say accelerating. 2002, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. The fallout of 9/11 led to the realignment of power in the U.S., with the shadow government stepping out into the open and implementing elements of a long-term agenda to subvert constitutional freedom and bring the states under total federal control. After the passage of the Patriot Act in late 2001, the next major step towards tyranny came with the expansion of federal government through the creation of DHS. The DHS has played the role of the domestic police state enforcer agency, encompassing every major law enforcement agency in the nation and 30-plus other federal agencies under one single office, now being handed over to international Interpol control and under the Israelis as well. With multiple subsequent reports and video productions fingering the American people as potential terrorists, the Orwellian-titled agency has proven to have nothing to do with security and everything to do with limiting the freedoms of the people all over the country and securing the banking takeover that was to come. 2003 invasion of Iraq, the move to start the dominoes for World War III. In March of 2003, the invasion of Iraq was a war based on a mountain of lies and deceit, and yet, at the time, the public swallowed the propaganda with wanton bloodlust. The constant invocation of the link between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein was repeatedly debunked before the war even began and after the invasion, but of course the war was set. The invasion was an illegal attack based on a wholly contrived pretext, and the war was not approved by Congress. This set of precedent for unconstitutional global preemptive strikes in the name of the war on terror. Conservative estimates put the death toll and the result of the invasion around 655,000, but this number is far higher when the previous year's sanctions are taken into account. Upon U.S. occupation of the country, Iraq was turned into one giant gulag with hundreds of thousands detained and held in internment camps for the most menial offenses. The real number is about 1.5 million dead. The occupation of Iraq provided the opportunity to build hundreds of military bases to be used to launch pad for future preemptive wars in the key geopolitical region of the Middle East. The Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal, of course, also came out. The Army's own report admitting children were raped in front of their parents at other camps. People were tortured to death for fake confessions. It was also meant to test U.S. forces and find people who liked torture, who could be moved then to be commanders of black sites all over the world. Now rendition has been expanded under Obama, I would add. Of course, all the famous things that happened there. Hurricane Katrina fallout, where FEMA ordered a stand down and that no aid be delivered so that FEMA could then claim that they'd screwed up and needed even more unlimited power and control and funding. And so that's really what went on there with Katrina. We had the liquid bomb scams of 2006, which led to tighter restrictions on airlines. Now we've had the underwear bomber to be used as the same. Now the TSA announces they're going on the streets, the buses, the trains of America, federalizing your police, training you that you have less rights than someone in Stalinist Russia. 2007, the rise of the Ron Paul Revolution, the rise of the resistance. People began to learn the Federal Reserve is the real government and is truly running the society. 2008, the bankers carry out the banking heist. The central banks that own the U.S. government set the course for the most egregious looting of American public in history with the passage of the TARP bailout legislation. And of course, we could have the Animal ID, Premises ID Act taking over the farms, the ranches, the threat integration centers being set up. The bailout merely increased the severity of the financial downturn and allowed the same elite to exploit the crisis in the pretext of centralizing control of the world economic system and creating a new world order and a single global currency under the SDRs. Henry Paulson was the chief architect of the bailout and the man who committed the financial terrorism by threatening Congress with martial law and food riots. Give folks a close shot of this. If they didn't pass the initial TARP package, brazenly pocketed $200 million in Goldman Sachs profits tax-free for himself, while handing out billions in ill-gotten gains to bankster buddies after he pulled a bait and switch by changing the entire focus of the bailout from buying up toxic debt to giving money directly to financial institutions. Over $24 trillion. Watson has a low number. It's $23.7 trillion and then another $5 trillion or $4.5 trillion. Acceleration of world government in 2009. 2009 represents the year that the agenda for world government was both openly announced and the acceleration of its implementation of reached breakneck speed as globalists exploited both the engineered financial crisis and the contrived global warming scam to move to finalize total dictatorial control over the planet. In October, New York Times editorial, "We Can Do It," Ban Ki-moon wrote that the efforts to impose restrictions on CO2 emissions must include an equitable global governance structure. The new EU president, Herman van Rompuy, said in December press conference that the Copenhagen Conference was the first step towards global government and management of our planet. Similarly, Al Gore, in a speech earlier this year, said that attempts to regulate CO2 emissions would be driven through global governance and global agreements. Although it failed to ram through a large portion of the global government agenda, the Copenhagen Agreement laid out the foundation for the introduction of a global transaction tax to be paid to private banks. But again, it was a huge victory, the equivalent of Washington at Trenton, when we defeated the main conference and when those emails got leaked. So major victory, showing people we can have victories. Ahead, we see the decade of freedom. The battle between tyranny and freedom is a long-term game of brinksmanship. However, as we move into 2010, we are reaching a critical time in modern history. Humanity must decide whether to engage in battle for freedom or accept the future under the rule of tyranny. And it's got a bibliography at the bottom of all the documentation. And I kind of hurried through that. I'm not a very good news reader. 3.5 hours into the show, I get a bit tired, but we'll have your decade of tyranny in review. but also your decade of awakening. Next week, a lot of open phones and some other very informative guests. I'm going to try to review last night's show with Ventura. I noticed when I took calls, almost every call brought up the TV show. And callers brought up how almost every call on C-SPAN is talking about the New World Order, stage terror, left-right paradigm, awakening. I mean, it's the globalists are going to strike back, though. I really do think they're going to nuke cities. They're going to do. I mean, you thought 9/11 was big. This underwear bomber stuff is just a test. Folks, we better expose these terrorists. We better expose these foreign bankers, or it's just, and all of you fools serving the system, you better grow up. I mean, this is, we've got Hillary Clinton's own treatise where she admits she loves communism and covertly taking over the government. The bankers fund the communist. They tell you when they rob you at gunpoint and put you in a labor camp that it's for the people.